Byline Audio.
Hello and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. The Byline Times is what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report, and what telly doesn't tell you. My name is Adrian Goldberg, and this time the real winners and losers at the Olympics. Apart from the gold medalists, the winners are, of course, sports nuts like me, getting a quadrennial fix of curling, surfing, badminton, boxing, track and field. 15 million tourists are packing Paris for this year's five-ring sporting circus. They'll be having a great time as well. As for the losers, well, we're joined by journalist Jade Lingard. Jade is the author of a book that looks at the negative side of the Games for inhabitants of the French capital's porous suburbs. We've also got Andrew Sims with us. Andrew is director of the New Weather Institute and a founder of Cool Down, the Sport for Climate Action Network. Their collection about climate change called Sporting Tales has just been published as well. Jade, I want to start with you, and your book is called Une vie face à la violence olympique, which basically means a city facing Olympic violence. That's a very strong way of describing Paris 2024. How come?
Hi, thanks for having me. Well, I know it's a pretty strong word, but actually what is going on here in Paris is pretty strong too, in a sense that, the Olympics 2024, it's 10 billion euros, more or less, as budget. So it's a lot of money. And this money is being spent on a 2-week event plus another 2-week event. And this has consequences on the neighborhoods where it happens. And to make it short, most of the Paris 2024 Olympics Games are happening in Seine-Saint-Denis, which is a very poor suburbs near Paris. And with the Olympics, building of housing, eviction of vulnerable people, migrants, documented or undocumented, people living on the street, all that have triggered why some people have called some kind of a social cleansing. And I don't want to say that it's only negative. And of course, the Olympics are a big party and a big feast, and it's great. But it wouldn't be fair not to see that it also has negative and sometimes quite violent impacts on the most vulnerable people.
You mentioned Saint-Denis. That was an area of Paris that I visited in 1998 for the World Cup, and the French National Stadium was placed there. And we were told at the time that this would be the spark of a regeneration for Saint-Denis. Has that happened?
Well, it has happened, but not in a way that is really helpful to the most vulnerable inhabitants, because what happened since 1998 is that you see now company headquarters, which were built around the stadium. And this hasn't helped really people having trouble with finding housing. So what we see now is that the Olympic Village has been built very near the 1998 stadium. And this Olympic Village will become a new neighborhood after the Games. The issue is that in order to build this Olympic Village, some people were evicted, like people living in a migrants' housing facility. So 300 of them were first evicted. Then 400 older people were evicted from a squat. And then you could see that around 5,000 people, so it's a lot of people, in a year were evicted from the Paris area between May 23 and May 24. We're talking about people living on the street, living in squats, living under the bridges, migrant families, some with very young children, undocumented workers, also some teenagers, coming from Morocco or Algeria. So a lot of people had to be pushed away from the Paris area in order for the Olympics to take place. And I guess this is one of the things that I would like to stress upon as violent process.
And what has happened to those people?
Well, it depends. Like the 300 men who used to live in the migrant housing, which was where the Olympic Village has been built, these people were given new housing. So these people have a roof over their head. It is not the case for the 400 people who were evicted from another squat called Unibeton. And for the 5,000 people I was talking about, the French government has created temporary kind of centers where they are bused to. but they can only stay there for a few weeks. And after a few weeks, they don't have solution. So most of them really have been moved away from the visibility of Paris. And this has been criticized a lot by organizations here and NGOs saying that it's not fair.
And you've also been personally involved, I understand, Jade, in a fight to save some community gardens in an area known as Aubervilliers, which has also been impacted by the Olympics.
Yes, because what happened is that for the Olympics, some other facilities were built. And one of them is a swimming pool that is used for the training of the water polo swimmers by now. But to build this swimming pool, they decided to destroy some community gardens. So these community gardens were actually destroyed in order to build a sunbathing area that was supposed to be connected to that new Olympic pool. Eventually, justice stopped. Another pool was built. To make it short, the sunbathing area wasn't built, but the community gardens were destroyed. Not all of them, but about 20, 25 community gardens. So you could say, well, it's not a lot and too bad, but not that dramatic. The issue is that these gardens are used by families, like simple people, not super poor, but, like retired workers and new migrant families. And so for them, it has been very dramatic, and they have lost somewhere where they could grow vegetables, where they could also meet and have some kind of social connections, and also, to be cooler when it's very hot in the city. And this has been probably one of the biggest fights linked to the Olympics. And that gives you a good idea of the negative effects of the Olympics. Basically, something very powerful, a lot of money, but decided by people who do not live in Seine-Saint-Denis and without much attention to the people living there.
Andrew, the Olympics was billed as the greenest games ever. How has that worked out in practice?
Well, really fascinating listening to Jade talk, because the things that she describes seem all too depressingly familiar from previous Olympics as well. There were similar things that happened in London in 2012, and many of the promises that are made at each Olympics very often are not fulfilled. And one of those is the green promise. And I have to say, I am a huge sports fan. I grew up addicted to watching events like the Olympics on TV. The visions of middle distance races burnt on my memory. But in Paris, and bearing in mind that we are about to face possibly the hottest summer on record, Paris wanted to be the greenest games ever. But what's happened is it's turned into a sort of like a billboard for very big polluters. So you have, as the largest top tier sponsor by some way, the car maker Toyota. Toyota, amongst the car industry, is the slowest mover, the biggest laggard in terms of taking climate action. And worse than that, there are multiple cases of them trying to block action towards having cleaner vehicles and reducing emissions. They're putting about 11 million polluting cars on the road every year, and their emissions, when you take account of all those cars sold, makes them possibly the biggest polluter compared to just 11 of the largest nations who are competing in the games this year. And then you've got other sponsors like the steel maker ArcelorMittal, the airline Air France, part of the KLM group. And these also in their respective industries are being some of the big blocks to climate action and climate movement. Of course, the reason why this matters so much is that when you're an athlete and you're performing a sport in summer, you're particularly exposed, especially in the sports that take place outside. We've already had multiple warnings from athletes about the fact that not just their health, but potentially even their lives are at threat under extreme heat conditions. We've seen multiple events being moved because of extreme weather. And you get sports people, people who are not fading flowers, people like David Pocock, who's the former captain of the Australian rugby football team, saying that this kind of high carbon sponsorship has become like the new tobacco. And I grew up at a time when tobacco sponsorship was really common in sport. Being English, I used to go and watch cricket. I used to go and see the Benson and Hedges Cup, and that was kind of normalized. And the other problem is, of course, that these kind of sponsorship deals for airlines, for SUV makers, they kind of normalize heavily polluting behavior, which of course is the very opposite of what sport needs, because global heating is a threat to the whole of sport. It's a threat to fans, it's a threat to athletes, and it's a threat to events as well. So you've got this weird situation where you've got the greenest games ever actually being a billboard for some of the worst polluters on the planet.
I know questions have been asked about whether we should indeed be holding this kind of sporting jamboree in future. It's a difficult balance, isn't it? Because as you've acknowledged, this is an event which brings people together physically from all over the world, and it unites the world as well in a different way through our televisions and through our laptops as well. And there is a value to that. I'm not necessarily weighing that against the urgency to deal with climate change, but is there a way that we can in some way bring 15 million people together for a month in a major city and still have something that is in any way environmentally responsible?
It's a really, really good question. And it's a question not just to the Olympics, but to the whole of sport and to other big competitions like the World Cup as well. And I think if you ask the question, how do you maximize the benefit from sport? How do you maximize the social benefits, the health benefits, the environmental benefits? I would argue that there needs to be a shift away from the big elite events and all the concentration placed on them, much more to local and grassroots sport. And at the moment, we can see with things like the World Cup heading in the wrong direction, going for bigger competitions with more teams, more traveling fans. Whereas we know actually from studies looking at the legacy of previous Olympic Games, that this idea that throwing a lot of money at elite sport will automatically lead to a regeneration of sport at the local level, that simply doesn't happen because the connections are not made. And I think if we can shift the balance so that perhaps we look for smaller events which are less frequent and which we make it easier for people to view in communal settings without necessarily having to kind of fly and travel to be there. And we've already seen really nice communal experiments with that by putting up big screens so you can get together in your local community. Lots and lots of ways in which we could do that. But at the very simplest level, what we have to stop is these sorts of events actually being adverts for high carbon, heavily polluting lifestyles and products.
Jade, one environmental improvement that has been noted in the run-up to the Olympics was the fact that you can swim in the Seine again. I'm not sure that everybody is willing to do that, but is it possible, in your view, to accommodate 15 million people, given that they will be helping to bring business to Paris, given the improvement in the Seine that we've seen? Is it possible to see positives from the Olympics?
Yeah, there is one positive thing that we can say. It is that the fact that they wanted to organize swimming competition in the Seine has created a deadline that scientists and engineers have been using in order to try to make their best to clean the Seine. The problem is that that wasn't enough. And what we are now finding out is that in spite of all the money spent on the cleaning of the Seine, I'm talking about 1.4 billion euros. It's a lot of money. All this money wasn't enough to make sure that the Seine now is cleaned. And this is linked to the way that the sewage system was built in Paris. I will not bore you with this, but it's a very complex situation. But what you just need to remember is that yes, it has improved. And the Olympics, again, has created an interesting deadline that motivated a lot of people to get there. But the problem is that now we are faced with a reality, pollution still too high in the Seine to make it sure that it's okay to swim in it. And this reality is kind of being blurred now or even confronted with by the storytelling and the communication of the city of Paris, because Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo, she has put a lot of issue in this. Like she said so many times that it would be okay to swim in La Seine. She swam last week. She organized this big PR event in La Seine. And so she was swimming in La Seine with one of the government's officials, Préfet Marc Guillaume, and also with Tony Estanguet, the president of the committee organizing the Olympics here in France. So all these big Olympics and politicians were all swimming in the Seine. And what did we find out? 2 days later, it wasn't clean enough. The pollution norms were still above what the World Health Organization requires from LACEN. So I'm saying this because I think it's a very interesting story. It shows that you can put so much money into something, but nature is very strong and pollution is a very complex issue. So the Olympics are no magical that can free you from your pollution issues.
And talking of pollution, I know that one of your stories leading up to the Olympics was about this highway connection that would link athletes in the Olympics village in Saint Denis to the centre of town. And this went right by a children's school. So this is a new fast superhighway, more polluting vehicles right next to where children are playing, going into kids' lungs.
Yeah, I know it's difficult to understand because it seems so much like something from the 20th century, but that really happened. It's not a new highway, it's a road leading to a highway. And so they built this road between the Olympic Village and the highway to make it easier for athletes to go there and leave from the Olympic Village. And they didn't pay attention enough to the school there. And it's a big school. It's 600 students. So it's a lot of people. And what happened is that inhabitants and parents, they went to court saying, but what are you doing? You are creating a threat, a health threat to our kids. And justice said, well, don't worry, because in a few years, it will only be electric car. And electric cars don't pollute the air so much. And also the economic value of this is more important than the health impact on the children. So that was a big outrage that was created by that. And eventually, the funny or not so funny thing is that in the Olympic Village, they put there some kind of pollution vacuum cleaners. They look like some kind of artificial trees, and they're supposed to kind of vacuum the pollution in the air. So they eventually agreed to give one of them to the school to help them out, but no one knows if they will really work. So it's really a big issue, this school thing.
This highlights a really interesting sort of parallel. It reminded me of a time when the same sort of dislocations were happening in London in advance of 2012. And there was a site which had some protected species on, and they offered to do ecosystem offsetting, which basically meant they offered to dig up a bit of earth, put it on a wooden pallet and shift it. And anybody who knows anything about biodiversity and nature will tell you that won't work. But the other interesting thing, perhaps perversely a positive thing, that what's happening in Paris has thrown a lot of light on how the city as a whole for the last few years, compared to other cities like New York or London, has been doing quite a lot to try to reduce traffic congestion and reduce cars, removing car parking spaces, putting in little micro parks. And ironically, Paris earlier this year voted to increase parking charges for non-resident SUVs. But then, of course, because the Olympics comes in with its whole separate contracts and legislation and sort of legal protections, they're allowed to walk in with the world's biggest fossil fuel burning car maker as their biggest sponsor, a prime maker of SUVs. So I suppose in a small way, the fact that it's thrown up these tensions and it shows just how we're not joining the dots yet is partially a good thing.
In terms of London, Andrew, I was lucky enough to attend a couple of events at the Paralympics in the Olympic Stadium in 2012. And I know the area around Stratford, which is where the Olympics were held, reasonably well. And Stratford, I don't think this is being disrespectful to it, in the run up to the Olympics was regarded as a pretty rundown, quite a rough, tough working class area. And elements of that remain. Visually, though, Stratford has been transformed. It's got a massive shopping centre there now, the Westfield Shopping Centre, and the streets immediately outside the station have been dramatically, I would argue, improved relative to how they were in 2012. Now, I'm sure there are issues arising from that, not least in terms of house prices and so on, and the affordability of accommodation for ordinary working people. But it has made a visible difference to that part of London.
I'm an Essex boy, and I grew up coming into London through Stratford into Liverpool Street, so I'm sort of familiar with the area as well. And I think you have to scratch the surface to see what these sort of lasting legacies are. And I would say it's largely open debate whether the Westfield Shopping Centre, temple of consumerism, is a good thing or not such a good thing. The park certainly has been a very pleasant asset. I'll be interested to see the degree to which the utilities are used. And one of the legacy statistics has shown actually that participation in sport post-London did not live up to the promises and has ailed and suffered recently. Sometimes visual aesthetics will hide the health and vibrancy of the local economy, because even though some parts of pre-Olympic Stratford might have looked scrubby, it was a kind of a dense network of small active businesses all doing their own thing. And I know a lot of those came a cropper because of the compulsory purchases, because they were compelled to move. So I think probably it would be good to talk to local people and ask them what they think about it. And clearly a lot of the new housing which has gone up there is definitely not of the affordable variety. London having a terrible problem with accessibility and affordability in housing anyway. I know a lot of the kind of the luxury flats which have gone up around there are certainly not the ones which are targeted at low income households in the area. And of course, you can kind of flip that round and say, should we not be improving our neighborhoods and investing in areas that need it anyway? I mean, certainly the additional transport infrastructure that's gone in has helped London as a whole, but I would argue that these are things that we could and should be investing in anyway, because they improve the health of the local population. There are ways that you can kind of stimulate local businesses. And of course, there's a very different economic vibrancy if you specifically support very locally rooted businesses, as opposed to some of the big chains that come in, the kinds which act like giant vacuum cleaners, sucking wealth out of an area rather than recirculating it within an area. And the work that we've done in the past on how local neighborhoods sort of operate is, if you have a kind of a higher level of genuinely local businesses, you tend to capture and keep more money and make it circulate better. So I think it's kind of a mixed picture, I think, where Stratford's concerned.
No, I think that's an interesting point, because those small local businesses, which may not have had glittering frontages, will not have their headquarters offshore and thereby be avoiding paying tax in the UK, for example. And I suppose it's another illustration of how the legacy is not always apparent. The former Olympic Stadium, now the London Stadium at which West Ham United play, is a hugely controversial item of legacy, because, of course, you do have Premier League football played at that stadium. My understanding is that the cost to the taxpayer every time West Ham play is something like £100,000. Such was the terrible deal done with the football club by the Legacy Corporation. So, yes, there is legacy, but it's a legacy that is costing the taxpayer over years millions of pounds.
It's an extraordinary thing, specifically with that stadium, which should have been a community asset. It should have been something for all sports, including athletics, and that was the original vision. And whilst that situation that you've just described goes on, where in effect you could argue that the taxpayer has massively subsidised an elite football club, at the same time, in South London, for the last 10, 12 years since the London Olympics, what used to be the home of athletics in Crystal Palace Stadium has crumbled and is only now just beginning to see some investment to bring it round. So, yeah, I think it's a pretty mixed picture.
Jay, do you think that there is a way that we can have such a massive festival of sport and in some way merge that with the interests of local people in a city like Paris, and particularly the kind of people that your journalism is concerned with, people who are very often shoved to the extremes of society, both geographically and in terms of how they live economically?
Well, this neighborhood, Saint-Saint-Denis, is a place where a lot of very young people live. It's one of the youngest territory in France. And these people, they love sports. Like, you can see people running, playing soccer, playing basketball. There's a very vibrant culture of sports. And so, yes, it could have been possible to do things differently. For instance, having tickets cheaper tickets. Tickets for the Olympics are super expensive. It goes up to a few hundreds of euros. And so it's impossible for a regular family to pay for them. So, of course, some tickets were a lot cheaper and some tickets were even given out for free by local authorities. But it's a very tiny amount in comparison with the 15.5 million tickets. So things could have been differently, but they would need to rely on a completely different economic system. Because, as you know, the Olympics are paid for by ticketing, sponsorship, and broadcasting. And this whole super capitalist way of doing the Olympics has the unavoidable consequences of having expensive tickets. So it would have to be completely different. And it could also be something more about daily sports practiced by people and not those amazing and quite extraordinary elite sport that people like to admire and like to watch, but have no connection. And maybe the last thing I could say about this is that some sports teachers have been complaining about the fact that there is not enough money left by the Olympics to their classrooms. And they're saying we need money, we need more time and more buses, more possibilities to take them to swimming pool to learn how to swim. And we need more money to have stadiums look better and so on. And they have been saying that it's really a pity that with 10 billion euros on the Olympics, there is no more money left for the years to come for the sports teachers.
Jade, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Great to hear from you and good luck with the rest of the Olympics. Thank you also to Andrew Sims. And just to let you know, if you want to check out either Jade's book or the book Andrew talked about, we will put a link to both of those. Jade's book is called On vit face à la violence olympique, and Andrew Sims' collection of essays called Sporting Tales. I'll put a link to those on the podcast hosting page as well. Before we go, just a reminder for you to check out our new podcast stream, bylineaudio.com. That features some terrific podcasts, including the myth-busting and very funny podcast with Otto English and John Mitchinson called Utter Bollocks. Byline Times Live with Peter Jukes crops up there regularly as well, and Adventures in Americana with Bonnie Greer and Hardeep Matharu. And if you head over to bylineaudio.com, you'll see that there is the option to pay for a premium package that gets you content that you can't hear anywhere else, including an ad-free version of this podcast. So if you are enjoying the Olympics, well, carry on enjoying it, but do so hopefully with a little bit more consciousness than has been permitted so far through some of our mainstream media. I'm Adrian Goldberg. This edition has been produced by me and Harvey White in Birmingham for Byline Audio. We'll see you again very soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.